All right, so we have been spending, obviously, this summer in Proverbs. Proverbs is teaching wisdom. The last 2 Sundays, we've been talking about what wisdom is and why we should want it. And I realize I've been referencing chapter 8 a lot, which continues to do the same thing. And so instead of going to chapter 8 and doing what we've been doing for 2 weeks, and really what I've already explained out of chapter 8 by way of cross-referencing, I went ahead and jumped to Proverbs 24. Proverbs 24, we get into very different kinds of applications of wisdoms. We're in about the 26th set of sayings in the Proverbs. And in Proverbs 24, we are called it's calling us to apply wisdom outside of the church, to apply wisdom in evils specifically that exist outside the church. Now, when I say that, I don't want to just kind of sugarcoat over the fact that how the church interacts with the world, specifically evils outside of the church, is one of the most complex and debated issues over the whole course of human history. And there's been a resurgence in tensions on these areas, and I think it's fair to say that the tensions are as high now in this debate of how we interact with the world outside us as they have been within my lifetime. For some of you, that's not saying much, but that's all I got is my 41 years. But there are questions now that are simple questions that are threatening to split churches. And they're questions like, what is the church's responsibility to the unborn? What is the church's responsibility to the sick and the poor and the needy? What is the church's responsibility to the refugees? What is the church's responsibility to racial tensions and racial injustices and inequities? What is the church's responsibility for political decisions that we would deem evil? I mean, these are questions that are literally splitting churches. But Proverbs 24 has something to say specifically to us about that, about how we as a church engage, and this is a minefield. And so as we walk through this minefield and we hear from Proverbs 24, we need to be on guard not to go to one of 2 extremes. So one extreme, and this has happened in church history, is to want every unbeliever to be conformed to biblical Christian obedience. You know, we can't expect that unbelievers are going to embrace Christian obedience. That's unrealistic. But at the other side of the spectrum, we have to be really sure that we're also not just drifting into some sort of isolationist position where we have nothing to say about real evils as they manifest themselves in the world. And so this passage, it talks about the conversations at the gate. So the gate of a city, that was the place when there was a big issue or a crisis. In verse 6, it actually says a war. When there are major decisions to be made, the gate of the city is where the leaders would come out and they would talk about this. They would debate it. Actually, most of the city, whoever wanted, could come out and listen to the debate. They could chime in if they felt like there was something for them to say. And so it's, it seems to me like for hundreds of years, this idea of a gate conversation was kind of, we got to listen on the news and stuff, but there wasn't a really substantive gate conversation happening for a long time because we no longer have gates to our cities that we gather and talk in. But it's interesting, in the past 10 years, with the rise of social media, that's kind of become the new gate, where everybody can say what they want about any cultural issue. So I think because we have all gotten a renewed access to the gate, Proverbs 24 is an especially helpful and applicable passage for us today. How is it that we engage the evils going on outside the church? What is our role, and how does that play out at our conversations at our gate? We're going to walk through this, and we're just going to look first simply at how it is that we're to engage, and then we're going to look at the hope we have as we engage. So, how we engage. This part's going to be the longer part. The passage actually gives us 4 principles as we engage, how we should engage. And the first one is to get counsel. Verse 5 and 6. A wise man is full of strength, and a man of knowledge enhances his might. For by wise guidance you can wage war, and in abundance of counselors there's victory. So the focus still is very much on wisdom. Wisdom is the call, and the proverb is saying that if you add counsel, That's kind of, you engineers will appreciate this term. It's like a force multiplier to your wisdom. Your wisdom is increased in this kind of exponential way, and the result is that you will have strength in some sort of very hard decision, in some sort of crisis or even war. You will know what to do. You will be strong, and you will not falter. Crises and wars are not won alone. It's something that we have to do together. And this is clear all over the book of Proverbs. Proverbs chapter 20, plans are established by counsel, by wise guidance, wage war. Proverbs 11, where there is no guidance, a people falls, but in an abundance of counselors there is safety. Proverbs 12, the way of a fool is right in his own eyes, but a wise man listens to advice. Proverbs 18, whoever isolates himself seeks his own desire. He breaks out against all sound judgment. And then lastly, Proverbs 15, without counsel, plans fail, but with many advisors, they succeed. So, how is it that we find this kind of counsel? You know, with all the voices out there, how do we know wise counsel when we see it, and how can we know that we're getting it? Well, it's not just information. Wise counsel is not just information. And I think there's a real place for books and podcasts and sermons. But if you really want to check this box of wise counsel, I would say it has to be a real person in your life who knows God and the Bible and knows you and your hopes and gifts and temperaments and fears and your unique situation and how to bring all these things together. I have a friend who says, we're all kind of in the same friend group. And he says, if I want to feel better about myself, I'm gonna ask this guy what he thinks. And if I really want to know the truth, I'm going to ask this guy. Because there have to be these people in our life that we know they're not just going to tell us the easy thing. We know they're not going to just tickle our ears. They're going to tell us what we need to hear. Now, that doesn't mean that you need to, find the most ornery, contrary person and bring them into your wise counsel. But it's someone who you know is going to tell you what is really best for you. So that's one principle of finding wise counsel. A second principle of finding, we're still in counsel. I know I said we're 4 principles. We're still in the first one. A second aspect, let's say, to finding wise counsel is not seeking somebody just because you know they're going to confirm what you want to hear. I mean, that is our tendency. That's the second one. So we find counsel. It's a person, not information. Second, it's someone who's really going to tell us the truth. And then third, we need a multitude of these people. We need an abundance of these counselors. We need a variety of perspectives. And so I was thinking about this, and it's interesting to see how this principle is actually woven into the very DNA of the church in the concept of elders. I mean, elders is this abundance of counselors taking place in church leadership. A church was not meant to be led by one pastor. There's the number one podcaster out right now. Some of you know exactly what I'm talking about before I even say it. At least in the category of spirituality and religion. The number one podcast, 41st actually, of all podcasts in the world right now, is called The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill. It's done by Christianity Today. And Mars Hill is, of course, many of you know, this mega church that was started in the late 90s, and it was planted and led by a pastor named Mark Driscoll. It became one of the most influential churches in the world. And in 2013, the whole thing just collapsed. Like overnight, disappeared. And so what this podcast is doing is trying to understand how it is that this unbelievably influential church can just disappear overnight, and what the church can learn about that collapse so that we don't make the same mistake again. And early on in the podcast, they make the point to show that one of the failings was that this pastor did not value wise counsel. Any dissenting voices in his midst, he made sure they were exited at least the area of influence, if not the church. He dismantled their elders because he didn't want them to have that much power and say into what he did. And then he developed an outside board of advisors of yes men that he picked at his choosing, and they served at his, what's the word in the present? At his, what? Bidding. We'll use bidding. There's another word, but discretion. That's what I was looking for. Yeah. But so they're saying the whole collapse happened in part because this principle of counsel and abundance of counselors, multiple counselors, was not heeded. It is built into the very fabric of the church in the form of elders. And I can say, every time there is a difficult decision in church leadership, whether in my former church or this church, I'm reminded of the blessing of elders. You know, in the height of quarantine, when our elders could not physically be together and make decisions, I would not say we were at the top of our decision-making game. But every time we really are together and we get to hear from each other, every time the decision is better than any one of us could have come up with by ourselves. And so it's just a picture that this is true, not just at the elder level, but all of us. When we make major decisions, especially in a time of crisis, we're going to make a better decision, and we're going to be stronger when we are able to make that decision with an abundance of counsel. You may remember Moses, his father-in-law Jethro, had some counsel for him as he was leading all of Israel. And because he heeded that counsel, because he was wise and listened to his father-in-law, the whole direction of Israel, and actually the whole direction of the world, was changed. And at the end of the day, if we're looking for wise counsel, this kind of biblical counsel, we don't have access to a better place for it than the local church. And so it's an interesting, we have a lot of new people in this church, and we have a lot of people who just come out of COVID, and there's lots of grace to just be coming on Sundays right now, but I want to push a little bit on that and push you towards really being involved and really being connected and really knowing people, because it's then that we can have these type of relationships that we can look around and know where we can get good counsel. And I know there's some people who feel like I've got that already outside of this church, so I'm okay in that area. Well, maybe that's true, but maybe you're depriving us of the blessing of you being wise counsel in our lives. So the church is a place that we should be able to be surrounded by an abundance of people who love us and care us and can give us the counsel that this proverb is pushing us towards. So, my challenge, if you are not a member of this church, come to Discover OGC next week, next Sunday. You can get your bulletin out, scan the QR code, register, all the information is in your bulletin, spend 3 weeks with me. We'll get some coffee, we'll grab lunch during that process, and you get to meet the rest of the leadership and just hear more about who it is that we are and what we do. And we want you to find not just a place to go on Sunday, but a church home. And we hope that this will be a blessing in that process, whether we're that church home or not. All right. Wise counsel is the first principle of engagement. The second one, and this may sound harsh, but I feel like the tone of the proverb is slightly harsh. But the second principle is deal with the fools inside the church. Verse 7, wisdom is too high for a fool. In the gate, he does not open his mouth. And so this isn't stating a fact. This isn't saying, hey, in the gate where the decisions are made, fools just don't tend to talk. Well, all of our lived experiences would say otherwise. Fools talk first. Fools talk loudest. Fools love to hear themselves talk. I mean, we understand that a fool is going to be quick to speak. He's going to be slow to listen. Fools tend to speak on things that they shouldn't. They tend to speak into areas they are not qualified to speak in. And so the way I interpret this isn't that fools tend to not speak at the gate. It's, hey, get your fools under care. We need to make sure that they're not the primary voices speaking here. And it doesn't just accord with my lived experience. I mean, this is what other verses and other proverbs say. Proverbs 12:23 says, a prudent man conceals knowledge, but the heart of a fool proclaims folly. Proverbs chapter 13 says, a fool flaunts his folly. So this proverb in 24 is saying, at the gate, keep them silent. A fool doesn't have enough he isn't able, he or she is not able to get high enough to get the wisdom needed to speak into these major decisions in these public affairs or these crises as they come about. And so we need to keep them quiet in those moments. One commentator goes so far as to say a fool must not be allowed to shape public opinion, policy, or settle disputes. A fool will not hear when he or she is wrong. He or she does not have the maturity to speak into certain issues. Proverbs 17:28 says, even a fool who keeps silent is considered wise. So we're to keep silent, and it will look like we're wise. When he closes his lips, he is deemed intelligent. So how do we apply this now? I'm definitely not applying it to politics and government, not just because that's not the main context, but I would disqualify a lot of our politicians. I think the way that we need to think about it is, who is it that's representing us? In major decisions, in major crises, when they happen, who are the Christians representing us? When I was in Mississippi, it was when they legalized same-sex marriage, when the U.S. legalized it. And so there were, I don't know how it played out here, but there were town hall meetings and just questions, and there was some largely cordial back and forth about the implications of the law. And of course, the Christians were being represented by pastors. Well, just because someone is a pastor does not mean they're wise. And we quickly realized that the pastors who should be speaking in this moment weren't, and the ones who none of us wanted to be speaking on our behalf, they were the ones speaking. Because the wise people were listening and not speaking too quickly, and the foolish pastors were the ones speaking and really creating more of a problem for all of us because of the way they engaged that issue. And so we very quickly collaborated and came up with a plan that they wouldn't be representing the church on this issue. Sadly, often our fools speak the loudest. There are pastors and books and podcasts to my right and to my left, both, that make unhelpful, divisive, quarrelsome, over-inflammatory remarks that are not, that's not the way I want to be I think we should be represented. Again, that's on the right, we have it on the left, and I think we as a church need to be careful not to bring those voices in here and not to perpetuate the foolery on social media. We would also do well to hold each other accountable in these areas. Some time ago, this person that I knew made a comment on Facebook that incensed me. And rather than calling this person the way that I should have, or just be silent, I made a foolish comment. And I had a dear brother who called me and said, Jim, what are you doing? This person is not helped out by this comment, and really you're not helped out by this comment very much. Just stop it. Call this person or stop it. And he was right. In that moment, I was the one making the foolish remark, and I needed to be silenced. I needed to be, cared for. And I felt very cared for in the way that he called me and talked to me, and I stopped. But that's our gate now. And social media has become a hot mess of a megaphone for people to say foolish things. People say things they would never say to another person in person. They say it in a tone they would never use with another person. And it's gotten us so sideways. So if that's our gate right now for most people, if you feel like you've gotten wise counsel, and you feel like there's something that you need to speak into, here are some questions that all of us, including me, would do well to ask before speaking out at the gate. Would I say this thing to that person's face? Would I use this tone if I were with that person? Does the world need to hear from me on this issue? Who is it that I'm really hoping will hear this? How exactly is my post helpful? And am I arguing in public with other people in my church? We need to make sure that the right people are speaking for us. And that starts by holding ourselves accountable in our foolish remarks, and then others in our midst. Then, third principle of engagement, the Proverbs tells us to identify the evil outside the church. So you can't engage if you don't identify it. This is verses 8 and 9. Whoever plans to do evil will be called a schemer. So that's identifying. calling a schemer. The devising of folly is a sin, and the scoffer is an abomination to mankind. So Christians should be able to identify the evil. And there's this escalation here in the way the proverb is speaking from just silencing to actually stopping, to censuring what it is that's going on outside the church. And I say outside the church because remember, in this context, they're discussing things that are going on outside of the city. So verse 6, they're talking about war, and then it's fleshed out a little bit more in verse 11. Rescue those who are being taken away to death. Hold back those who are stumbling to the slaughter. So Proverbs 24 doesn't give us the very specific details of what's going on, and I think that's God in his wisdom doing that so that we can focus more on the principles so that we can apply that in various times of crises and evils around us. But we do have an obligation as Christians to be a voice for the voiceless, those being led away to the slaughter, stumbling to the slaughter. And when I think about how it is that we identify those evils, probably the best framework we have is the Imago Dei. So Imago Dei means image of God. About once a year, I try to do a full sermon just on this because it's so important that we understand for our framework to be able to understand evil and be able to call it as such, identify it as such when it is in our presence. So the image of God, the doctrine of the image of God means that we are made in God's image. And that doesn't mean we look like God. When I first heard it years ago, that's what I thought it meant. I guess this is what God looks like. It doesn't mean we look like God. It means there's something about us that separates us from the rest of creation. And that thing is that we have the capacity to love and be loved. That's what separates us from the rest of creation. And I know we love our pets. We love our dogs. I've got a 16-year-old dog, and I will cry like a baby when that dog passes. And that dog looks like she loves us, she wags her tails and snuggles, but that dog can't love the way that a person can. And that dog knows who feeds, the dog knows who gives walks. There's a lot of, that's instinct in there. And she's special, and dogs are special. Cats, some people think they're special too, but no matter how special an animal is, it is not a human because they do not bear the image of our Maker the way that humans do. And even though our image has been marred almost beyond recognition because of our sin, we are still image bearers. And every image bearer should get the dignity that comes along with the image they are bearing. And so this is why Christians fight so hard for the unborn. And before I go any further, I know statistically speaking, there are those of you, you're here who have had an abortion or been a part of the decision-making process. So here's what I don't want to do. If you found yourself in a hard time and you made a decision that you regret and you have received a lot of, Jesus has grace for all of us, no matter what we've done. I'm not here to pile more guilt on. And in fact, I would go so far as to say, the women who have confided in me in the church that they've had abortions in the past, they are some of the most passionate people in the pro-life movement because they just know this walk better, certainly better than I ever will. You know, the Vicki Matthews, she has come and she's told her story here. She leads Women's Choices Clinic, and she had an abortion and she went. She did it. She regretted it. That's how she found Jesus. She received grace from Jesus Christ. And now, because of the grace she's received, she goes out and tries through the Women's Choices Clinic, both offices now. She's devoting her life to showing women there is another way. There is another hope. We can have this baby and take care of it. So I don't want to pile guilt on, but I don't want to minimize the fact that there is no greater group in our world, no greater group of people being led to slaughter in the sheer numbers. 125,000 babies die a day worldwide from this, and walking there with so little defense. So this is why Christians care. I've seen comedy shows that be like, why do Christians care so much? Because they bear the image of God. That's why. This is also why Christians identified slavery as the evil that it was. This is why Christians initiated the civil rights movement. When people's dignity is affected because of the color of their skin, this is an image of God issue. And some people say, well, the church doesn't need to speak into those kinds of issues because it's political. The church shouldn't get political. It's not a political issue. These both, the unborn and this, these are an image of God issues, Imago Dei issues. So we get involved. And I actually think that the greatest challenge, we are in a renewed height of tension, in racial tension in our culture. And I think the biggest challenge that we face is that the conversations in the gate around the areas of race are starting and continuing outside of the church, not inside it. The civil rights movement started inside the church. It was fueled and supported inside the church. Well, now these conversations and racial tensions, they're so far outside of the church that they lack the wisdom needed to be able to empathize and come up with helpful ways forward. It was Christians who identified sick people in the Middle Ages. Instead of shunning them, created hospitals for them. It was Christians, when the plagues would move through, that would bring sick people, because they bared the image of God, into their home at great risk to themselves and care for them. It was Christians who identified the parentless in societies and created orphanages. It is Christians around the world now who are helpfully engaging issues of sex trafficking and refugees. Christians are doing these things because Christians are called to care about the dignity of all image bearers. And I want to be really clear about what this does not mean. There have been times in church history that the church has used verses like this to try and get everyone in society to conform to Christian obedience with penalties of punishment, incarceration, and death. And so there have been days where the church has imprisoned or stoned women who commit adultery. There have been days where, in church history, where men who engage in same-sex relationships were murdered. That's not what this proverb is saying. We're not expecting unbelievers to conform to a Christian ethic. And there are places around the world today, mostly in the Muslim world, where the same kind of scenarios of adultery and same-sex relationships do result in incarceration, whipping, lashing, and even murder. And there are Christians in those parts of the world who are coming alongside these people and working for their protection, not because they're condoning the behavior, but because they know that they bear the image of God, and we're called to come alongside people who are headed for the slaughter. We fight for the freedom and dignity of all image bearers. And once we identify the evil, this is our fourth and last principle, we engage. There is actual engagement, because this passage has very serious and harsh words for the Christians who seek wise counsel, who identify the evil, but cowardly do not engage. Verse 12. If you say, behold, we did not know this, does not he who weighs the heart perceive it? Does not he who keeps watch over your soul know it? And will he not repay a man according to his work? This isn't something that we opt out of. This passage says there's a reward in some way for those who engage evil outside of the church, and there is a punishment in some way for those who don't. We can't look at evil and just kind of think that somebody else is going to do it. Or just put our head in the sand and think that it'll go away. Or just think like, well, I don't feel like I have the ability to engage that big problem. Well, everybody can do something. Even just asking somebody else for help. We can pray. We can do things. And there is a call to action here. And the Lord is saying he knows our hearts, he knows our thoughts, and he knows our motives. And we're to remember that when we're looking at evil in the world. Bruce Waltke, he writes, if you turn a blind eye to helping victims and do nothing to help them, the protector of life will turn a blind eye to you in your crisis. Wisdom makes us strong, and our response to evil in this world shows us how much wisdom we actually have. I mean, when there's wisdom is lacking, that is when society really suffers. That's why verse 10 says, if if you faint in the day of adversity, your strength is small. If you don't show strength in a crisis, the fundamental flaw, the thing that's lacking is wisdom. Our God acts justly. He does not act cowardly, and we're to act in the same way, which very naturally brings us to our hope as we engage these evils. And as I said, this is the shorter part. So verse 13 through 22, we see our hope. Our hope as we engage evil is fundamentally in the fact that this life is not all that there is. Verse 13, my son, eat honey, for it is good, and the drippings of the honeycomb are sweet to your taste. Know that wisdom is such to your soul. Okay, so understand this. We have to know a little bit about honey, which fortunately for everybody, over the past year, I've learned a lot about honey. My brother decided as a hobby he was going to take up beekeeping. He now has 9 hives of bees, and I thought it was really weird when he started doing this, but now I'm fascinated by bees. Just go and Google bees. It will take you down a rabbit hole you didn't know existed. They are fascinating creatures. But when their honey, since ancient times, well before even the writings that we're reading today, honey has always been known to have some sort of medicinal value. And we know now that there's microbial activity that causes it to actually facilitate healing. We know that because of the way that the bees take the local pollen and put it in the honey, that it can help and even stop our allergies because we're being kind of inoculated to those pollens in our midst. And so we've used honey in all kinds of different ways over the ages. When I was a kid, it wasn't uncommon to have a little spoonful of honey and bourbon for the cough, to help a kid in his coughing. I'd probably be arrested for that today. But there's a lot, I'm sure bourbon does most of the work in that concoction. But you put, the honey at least makes it sweet. But we've always looked at honey as something that not only has medicinal value, but unlike most other medicines, it tastes good. You know, if you have kids and you give them medicine, what's the first question they ask? What flavor is it? Because I know most medicine, you tell me it's cherry, but that's not cherry. So honey is both physically medicinal and good tasting. And so this metaphor makes a lot of sense. There's this comparison to in the way that honey is sweet to the taste and physically heals us, the same thing is true spiritually when we internalize wisdom. That's what the proverb is saying. And this is what the last part of verse 14 says. If you find it, that is wisdom, there will be a future, and your hope will not be cut off. One commentator said, wisdom has all the immediate sweetness of honey, but also the additional characteristics of a pleasure that lasts for eternity. True biblical wisdom finds its fullness in Jesus Christ. If you've heard nothing over these few weeks, I hope you hear that. True biblical wisdom finds its fullness in Jesus Christ because only Jesus can give us the eternal life that this wisdom literature is talking about. There's a foreshadowing going on here because we know if we fast forward in the story that Jesus not only died, but he rose and was resurrected, and so too shall all of we who believe in him. There is a rising that will come, and this is what verse 16 is foreshadowing. For the righteous falls 7 times, yet rises again. It doesn't matter how many times we fall in this life as we were fighting the evils of this world. There will be a resurrection that will be sure and complete and final and eternal in Jesus Christ. So we don't have to live for this world. We're not here for this world. We don't have to live for the world's values. We don't have to live to build up ourselves and honor us. We get to live for the world to come and build up he who made it all and honor him with our lives. Because one day, and really the life is not that long, one day we're going to be through with all of this mess. And we're going to be in glory with him. And the worst of lives is just going to feel like a bad night's sleep by comparison. So we do not live for this world. And we delight in the internalization of the revealed moral order that God has given us in his word. And we also know that while we do fight evil in this world, while we do long for justice, ultimately we are not the people who are going to bring it about. Verse 19, fret not yourself because of evildoers, and be not envious of the wicked. For the evil man has no future. The lamp of the wicked will be put out. My son, fear the Lord and the king, and do not join with those who do otherwise. For disaster will arise suddenly from them, and who knows the ruin that will come from them both, that is, from God and the king. So God brings his judgment, and it is such a fearful judgment that is coming one day that we should not wish it on our worst enemy. Verse 17, do not rejoice when your enemy falls, and let not your heart be glad when he stumbles. So we hope that we have success. But our hope ultimately isn't in what we can do and the success that we can bring in this life. We pray that God would be honored through our actions, that he would, that his image bearers would receive the dignity that he wants in this life. But when that doesn't happen, we don't lose our hope because we know that there was one who bore the image of God perfectly in every way. That sin did not taint the image that Jesus Christ bore to this world. Yet Jesus willingly was marred on the cross in our place so that our image could be restored. So when we think about that, when we're looking at evil and the oppressed and those who are being led to the slaughter, we have to put ourselves in the story and see that that was us. We were the oppressed. We were the spiritually sick, and willingly so. We were actively in rebellion against God. We were actively a part of the kingdom of darkness until Jesus came into our lives. So because Jesus pursued us as we were stumbling toward the slaughter, we now have hope as we engage others, because we're not just doing it because it's right. We're not just doing it because God deserves it, and those are good and right things. We're doing it because as we engage in this way, we are painting a picture of the gospel. We're showing the world what Jesus has done for us. So we engage. We engage through counsel, through prayer, through wisdom, but we engage. That's the message of Proverbs 24, and I hope a message that is helpful to us in a season where it's more tense than it's been in a while, and there are just more voices speaking than most of us are used to. Let's pray. God, we do thank you for just one more reminder that you are not, putting before us these evils we need to battle so that we can earn our way into your kingdom. You bring us into your kingdom, then you equip us. You don't make us prove ourselves. You equip us to go out and engage the evils of this world. Let us be wise and not go to these extremes that we can go to, but stay focused on Proverbs 24, on wisdom and the ultimate fulfillment of wisdom in Jesus Christ. That we would be wise in the way that we think about things and what we say about things and in the way that we engage things. God, we thank you and we love you and we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.